national anthem, and also during taps and all other occasions when a hand salute is customarily appropriate. We've got a lengthy program to get through this morning, and without further delay, I'd like to ask Peggy Costigan here to come and sing our national anthem. If you would all please rise, and at the conclusion of the national anthem, remain standing for a blessing. Thank you.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Peggy. By your program, you can see that we're supposed to have an invocation by Rabbi Harvey Abramowitz, a property owner here in Wallenpaupack Lake Estates, who has a home up on Ski Bluff. Those of you who might know the rabbi personally also know that his official retirement date is the 1st of October. And that at the time when we put the program together, everything was thumbs up and A-OK go. However, as Murphy would tell you in his law, that something that can go wrong typically will, at least to some degree. So at this point, Harvey is attending to an urgent need on the part of his synagogue. He did, however, send words. And so this, I think, in my career, both wearing uniform and not, I think this is the first where I'm the stand-in for a Jewish rabbi. So please bow your heads and reflect upon these words of his. Heavenly Parent of us all, 9/11 is a date most Americans will forever recall. Most can tell you exactly where they were when the attack struck in New York City, in Washington, D.C., and here in Pennsylvania. Many watched the TV replays and were shocked our nation. We were attacked here in our homeland for the first time since December 7th, 1941. Many New Yorkers were eyewitnesses to the carnage we commemorate this morning. We felt and still feel sadness, loss, and anger at experiencing and recalling these actions and those we saw recently in Charlottesville, Virginia. People at their very worst. Recently, we saw and some experienced nature at its worst, with Sandy in New York, Harvey in Texas, and now Irma in Florida. This morning, I'd like to focus on another aspect common to all of these tragic events, that of seeing and experiencing people at their very best. The responses we saw to both the natural disasters and the man-made ones give us all reason for hope and reminders not only of tragedy, but of people mobilizing and reaching out to offer help and assistance to other people. At such time, the color of one's skin, national origin, language, religion, or gender became irrelevant to those responding. That goodwill is what I wish to celebrate today. The knowledge that we can rise above suspicion, distrust, and disregard for each other based on our diversity. We are today reminded of the best that it is in all of us. And I call on all my neighbors and friends to treasure this awareness. This is how we are when we are at our best. We are all created in the image of God and ought to love our lives and live our lives. Guide us by our highest instincts. Remember, we are always in the presence of divinity. Remember, too, how good it felt when you reached out to others in their times of need. Try then to remember to live every day in the spirit of our highest moments. This is the everlasting tribute we can pay to our fallen, the finest example we can instill in ourselves and in our progeny, and the greatest strength of this, the greatest nation in the world, these United States of America. Amen. Thank you, and please be seated. Okay, I need to do a little bit of an introduction and a reflection. If you recall, last year, the 15th anniversary of 9/11, we also had a guest speaker on that occasion, our congressman at the time, Congressman Tom Marino. And you might recall also that at the conclusion of last year's comments, I brought to everyone's attention the very significant and very gratifying experience that I have the fortune to interact with young people from all around our region who are applying to the service academies for admission. And at that point, I also brought to everyone's attention that this community should justifiably be proud of the fact that from this community, we actually have 2 Service Academy members from our residents. At this time, I'm proud to bring to your attention that Allison Zablocki is now in her final year at West Point, and this coming May, she'll be commissioned into the United States Army as a second lieutenant. And I will also bring to your attention that Amy Jordan, who is the granddaughter of the first president of WLE and the daughter of a recent member of the community who ran for the board of directors, is in her 3rd year at Annapolis. And so in about a year and a half, she will graduate from Annapolis and be either in the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Marine Corps. Now, I've had the pleasure of interacting with such young people now for 15 years, actually a little over 15 years. And as you would imagine from at least this brief portion of my introduction, that I've had the great opportunity of interacting with a great number of young patriots. And just as there is always a beginning, we have here present with us today the very first young person that I had the fortune of interacting with and assisting in his appointment to the military academy at West Point. Now, some further belaboring kind of introduction and backstory is certainly appropriate. You see, there's more to the story than just the fact that he happened to be the first cadet that I assisted in getting into my alma mater at West Point. In 9/11 of 2001 played a significant role in that for both he and I. Many of you are aware that in 2003 I bought a property here in WLE, and I came here a couple years later permanently from a place called Fairfax, Virginia. And Fairfax, Virginia is in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And Washington, D.C. is full of government people, a lot of military, and a lot of other government, federal government personnel. And there's a lot of comings and goings in the whole region with military and federal employees that come and go to Washington, D.C. And so it wasn't a big surprise when the house right next door to me was turned into a rental unit. And the community hubbub was that a State Department officer was coming back from an overseas assignment, and they were going to reside in the house next door. As it turned out, that was the Roberts family. Now, a little bit about my observations, because in the Washington, D.C. area, there are two things that you do. You work long hours, and you sit in traffic. And that hasn't changed, as I understand, but you don't have that much time to actually interact with your neighbors like you do here in our community. So it took a bit of time, and I had in the first year of their occupancy next door, I had a number of observations. At Christmas time, a Christmas tree would go up. Hanukkah time, a menorah would go up. Easter time, eggs and a bunny would go up. And at Ramadan, there was very little happened until after dark, and then all of a sudden, cars showed up all over the street. And something else that I observed in this first year was that, well, people were coming and going. A whole lot of people coming and going. And some of them were dressed very, very differently. And as time went by, I got to know the Roberts family much more better. Don, as it turned out, the father, was born in Minnesota, just as I was. And he had a very good education, having gotten a graduate degree from Princeton University. And he was a retired Foreign Service officer, having served at many overseas postings, and predominantly in the Middle East. He was a very deliberate, articulate, ethereal, well-educated diplomat. You could not ask for a better role model to be representing our country in the State Department at overseas postings. Hadia, Don's wife and Lee's father, or Lee's mother rather, loved and honored everyone and their traditions and their customs, as evidenced by the story of all the different seasons and religious observations that I just related. She was the perfect State Department officer's wife. Her father was a retired general, having served during World War II in the British Army after graduating from Dehradun Military Academy in India. Now, this is an affiliate of the United Kingdom's Sandhurst at the time, which is the British equivalent to West Point. After the war, the United Kingdom granted independence of the territories in the subcontinent, and India and Pakistan were divided or separated largely along religious lines. General Jelani, Hadia's father, and his family moved to Karachi, Pakistan, shortly after the creation of the Pakistani government. And he became involved in international relations. And was politically associated with the early establishment of the Pakistani government. In the early 1950s, he was the first defense attaché to the United States from Pakistan, where he negotiated an alliance between Pakistan and the United States. General Gilani was awarded the Legion of Merit Medal. That's a U.S. service, very significant medal, while he was here in the United States. And it was personally presented by the President of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower. When he was reposted back to Pakistan, he believed that democracy was the right thing to do, in the right direction to go for the young country. But Pakistan was not going that direction. So in the early 1980s, he and his family immigrated to the United States, again in part because he had a strong belief in education to all of his children, including his daughters. I'm sure that General Gilani now, who had been awarded the Legion of Merit, is very proud of the accomplishments of his grandson. His eldest daughter, Hadia, was also well educated here in the United States. In fact, she was a graduate student and got a graduate degree from Mount Holyoke College. Hadia was multilingual, including languages and dialects she learned at home in her family's ancestral area, now referred to as the tribal area between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, just as we all know, parents are the most significant influence on young people when they're maturing through life's experiences. And so it was with Lee Roberts. And this multilingualism and tolerance for people of different backgrounds and different religions rubbed off on young Lee Roberts. He was different than his parents in some regards, however. He was a Star Trekker. He was very involved in a whole number of martial arts, and it seemed like he was always coming and going in some other get-up. And he was always musical, involved in the band, choir, and with his stereo, and sometimes it was too loud. And then 9/11 happened. And Don, who was a retired U.S. government State Department officer, found a contractor that he could make a difference with in making a contribution to our nation's needs. And in time, Don would even volunteer to be posted overseas and deployed to a combat zone to assist the U.S. State Department in its overseas mission. Hadia began in earnest in her service as a linguist and an analyst with the federal government, applying her multilingual talents to the benefit of the United States Department of Justice, the FBI, and the intelligence community. And not long after 9/11, I got a knock on my door. And it was a young teenager, Lee Roberts, saying, "Colonel Braun, I know you went to West Point. I want to go there too. Will you help me?" And now the rest of the story is probably fairly self-evident, but there are a few more things that I need to relate. You see, a bit more context. Yes, he went to West Point. And as a practicing Muslim going to West Point shortly after 9/11, I'm sure there are even some stories that he hasn't shared with me, and some challenges in life that probably we can only imagine, much less get firsthand knowledge of. His passion for music went with him to West Point. So when the West Point Jewish Chapel Choir had a need for a new conductor, Cadet Lee Roberts, a practicing Muslim, applied and became that conductor of the Jewish Chapel Choir. And one notable event occurred in 2006 during a holiday reception at the White House, when the Jewish Chapel Choir sang and provided entertainment, singing carols under the direction of a practicing Muslim director. So it's now been 10 years since Captain Roberts has graduated from West Point. And I invite him now to come share some of his perspective of 9/11, looking back now 16 years.
Good morning, and thank you, Colonel Braun, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the community of Wallenpaupack Lake Estates for so graciously hosting my father and me this beautiful Monday. You probably heard Colonel Braun reference earlier to the fact that this was a lengthy program. You may think that he's the predominant culprit for that, but I'm unfortunately about to disabuse you of that notion. I hope that I can do justice to the time that you set aside to be here today. There can be no doubt that the events of this day, 16 years ago, were utterly remarkable. In some respects, they were wholly without precedent. A commercial airliner had never deliberately collided with a building in the United States, nor had a terrorist attack ever been so deadly in the history of the entire world. In other cases, we were faced with precedents that we thought long obsolete because of tectonic shifts in the world order. No foreign adversary had staged an attack on the United States with such terrible consequence since Pearl Harbor. The effects of 9/11 were at once symbolic, costly, and agonizingly human. With the literal crumbling of what had been towering, living monuments to American leadership in a maturing global system, and a smoking crater marring the very nerve center of the arsenal of democracy, we in the entire world watched in disbelief as the evidence of this surreal turn of events was broadcast live into our homes, schools, and offices. Dozens of billions of dollars of property and infrastructure damage were only the start of a dizzying and rapidly growing financial bill, on which all other items would be dwarfed by a single, thereto difficult to imagine event. The New York Stock Exchange shut down for 6 days, its longest closure since 1933, extinguishing more than $1 trillion in wealth in the space of less than a week and precluding the generation of an even greater amount in the meantime. While its true symbolic and financial injuries are felt on some level by the entire country, it was the human cost that justifiably overwhelmed us most. It is that cost that is so appropriately memorialized behind me. Nearly 3,000 lives were snuffed out in the various impacts and same-day structural fallout of the attacks. More than 6,000 people were injured. The toll mounts to this day, as well over 1,000 emergency workers, first responders, and ground zero volunteers have succumbed to a host of debilitating conditions brought on by intense, prolonged exposure to toxic and carcinogenic building materials in the rubble. Literally tens of thousands more are confirmed or suspected to be sick, and many of them are worsening. The September 11th attacks did not solely precipitate the loss of American lives here at home. In response to the high water mark reached by terrorist tactics that day, the United States embarked on a global war on terror, an enduring undertaking that's seen well over 2 million service members deployed overseas. Nearly 7,000 of those have perished in the endeavor. More than 50,000 have been injured. These numbers, however, pale in comparison with the volume of invisible wounds sustained by my brothers and sisters in arms. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that as many as 1 in 5 veterans of the global war on terror are affected by post-traumatic stress disorder, and that as many as 1 in 3 will become clinically depressed. For multiple deployers, that number increases to 1 in every 2. Many go undiagnosed. Beginning in 2012 and holding true since, suicide accounts for more service member deaths each year than hostile action in combat. So far, I haven't told you anything that you didn't either already know or couldn't find out for yourself. Why, then, did I rattle off this litany of costs, this inventory of injury? I want to tell you a small amount of my own story. My story is about service and sacrifice, but not my own. Because you should know that of those who wear this uniform, I am among the least valorous. My sacrifice has been negligible. And my service, like my life, has been charmed thus far. My story is about the service and sacrifice to which I have borne witness. So I felt the need to establish a context to depict the landscape of injury, loss, and psychological burden that service members, law enforcement officers, first responders, aid workers, and others ventured into in order to help. They continue a sacred tradition of service to country and fellow human being that helps make our national endeavor a noble one. The road that I and others walk today was paved by giants, the tireless national servants who went before us. I didn't have to look far for my own giants. My father, who's here today, served more than 30 years as a U.S. Foreign Service officer and almost a decade more in his second career as a defense intelligence analyst. He continues to mentor me in the fields of foreign policy and national security on a daily basis. He's the most decent human being I know, a fact I readily admit. He's also the smartest, a fact I will not admit if questioned later, particularly if questioned by him. My mother, as Colonel Braun mentioned, spent nearly 7 years as an FBI linguist. As a former English professor with native-born fluency and high-level literacy in the rare languages of Pashto and Urdu, her expertise was truly irreplaceable. And she committed herself tirelessly to supporting the fight against terrorism until she lost her own fight with cancer, the same year I graduated from West Point. Recognizing that literally no one could do what she did for her country at the level she did it, she insisted on reporting to work at the FBI until she could no longer walk. She was a warrior. My mother was also the first family member with whom I discussed the attacks. I was in 11th grade on September 11th, 2001. And along with my classmates, I watched the impact of United Flight 175 into the South Tower of the World Trade Center live on CNN, as I'm sure many of you did. While we were stunned by this more or less impossible to process sight, the news of a terrorist attack on the Pentagon struck us far closer to home in multiple senses. 4 of the kids in the classroom at the time of the announcement had parents who worked at the Pentagon. Not everyone had a cell phone at that time, and in any case we had to keep them in our lockers during class. So they had to leave the classroom in order to find out if their parents were okay. As I watched them leave, I distinctly remember imagining what it would be like to pick up a phone knowing that I was about to find out whether or not one of my parents had been killed. I remember thinking I probably wouldn't have the nerve, and I'd need someone else to help me make the call. None of those kids lost their parents to the plane that hit the Pentagon, but hundreds of kids that I couldn't see yet lived only minutes from me did. That evening I spoke to my mother about what had happened. We didn't know who'd perpetrated the attack. The government took several days to confirm that Al-Qaeda was the prime suspect, and in fact the organization didn't claim responsibility until 2004. I do remember her saying one phrase several times that first evening, and I didn't immediately process the significance, but she said, "Let it not be people who call themselves Muslim who are behind this." I later found out that this was a common hope among American Muslim families, a hope that was dashed. She spent more time at work in the weeks that followed, and many details unfolded in the meantime in the press. The U.S. had concluded that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks, and the Taliban regime of Afghanistan was sheltering its leader. Soon we saw footage of Operation Enduring Freedom getting underway, and seemingly in a lightning strike, the Taliban were ousted by an unlikely partnership of American Special Operations Forces and indigenous Afghan militias. People in our town of Fairfax, Virginia, who had never heard of Afghans or Pashtuns when I met them, now grasped who they were and where they lived. The two sides of my heritage had come back into acute contact, and I began to question my thereto solidly entrenched life ambitions. Until that point, I planned that after graduating from high school, I would simply continue to teach Taekwondo in the same strip mall studio where I'd worked for my summer job. Ambitious, I know. I formed a new goal, national service, in a way that I could bring my background and upbringing to bear for my country. I decided almost immediately that said service should take the form of time in the armed forces. As a child, I developed an extremely positive opinion of U.S. service members through interaction with sailors, airmen, and Marines, whom my parents would host for Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners during my father's foreign service tours in the Persian Gulf. Despite my experience up to that point having been almost exclusively with members of the other services, I decided that the Army would probably play the largest role in the upcoming conflict, and that an Army career would best position me to use the intrapersonal advantages that my upbringing granted me. I further decided that I'd try to become an officer. It seemed to me the best way to do that was by going to West Point. I accepted an invitation to attend a summer session at the Academy in 2002 and fell in love. My alma mater ran a pretty slick marketing operation and still does from what I understand. My parents first learned of my interest in West Point when I asked them to sign a permission slip for that workshop. They were stunned but supportive. When I returned, now obsessed with gaining an appointment, they offered me perhaps the single most helpful piece of advice anyone gave me throughout the admissions process. Mr. Braun went to West Point. You should talk to him. It was then not long before the knock that Colonel Braun mentioned in his opening remarks, and he opened the door on the very first candidate whom he would help gain an appointment to the military academy. My graduation was far from assured. I only got in off the waiting list, and I took an extra semester to graduate. Much later, I understand that as a true strategic thinker, he was leaving himself plenty of room for improvement. And he's made it. Dozens of Army officers began their journey of national service as a direct result of Colonel Dan Braun's mentorship through the Academy admissions process in the Army, and dozens more are slated to do so. This active legacy, perhaps even more than his own decades of personal federal service, makes him such a clear example of achieving West Point's ideal for every graduate to lead a lifetime of selfless service to the nation. I was certainly not the only one in my West Point class convinced to pursue national service by the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. In fact, the class of 2007 was the first class to apply to the Academy in our entirety after the attacks took place. Our class crest is unique for every graduating class, features the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. As a nation, we say of this day, never forget. My class motto reflects this and recalls our shared motivation for serving. It goes, always remember, never surrender. Always remember. It's fitting that I reflect on those words today as we collectively remember. My service has given me a lot to remember, some of it painful, but the vast majority of it uplifting and inspiring. When I tell you that I'm among the least valorous of those to wear this uniform, I'm telling you from a good deal of firsthand experience of incredible leaders and soldiers of every faith and background who act every day to earnestly try and make the world a better place for America and its values. When I say my sacrifice has been negligible, among other memories, I'm drawing on multiple firsthand observations of soldiers learning to use their new prosthetic limbs and the sheer might of their positive attitudes has shamed me out of whatever frivolous funk I'd allowed to settle on me that day. I'm drawing on memories of caring, challenging, and nurturing mentors, and of eager students who made far better use of the lessons I imparted them than I did by having them to impart in the first place. It's the brilliance of that mosaic of inspiration that fills my mind's eye when I think of national service now. Service is a light, a sure, bright illumination pouring forth from a great lamp, forged in courage and held aloft by the love of country of generations of Americans. People who decided that they would devote their lives to healing the world, to protecting and improving the lives of others, in uniform or out of it, hunkering in foxholes, taking hills, or clearing rooms, opening and filling children's minds in classrooms, reassuring citizens on a patrol route, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, treating the sick, racing to the scene of an accident or a fire or a distress call, whether with sirens blazing or in tactical silence. When people choose to serve, they choose the fight in its many forms. I've described their service as a light. The terrible event of 16 years ago today and its aftermath became a prism for that light, ensuring that it would shine even brighter and with even more focus. They choose not to surrender to complacency. They choose to carry American values to the ennoblement of the human condition, no matter how mean it may be for them in that or any future moments. We're among many people here today who made that choice, and many who have also supported loved ones who chose similarly. I'm profoundly grateful to you. That choice is to never surrender. Never surrender. Never. At the close now of my first decade of service as an officer, I find myself considering with true understanding for perhaps the first time the meaning of never surrender. The realization that forever is just that, and that the forces demanding surrender take many more varied and insidious and familiar forms than superheated pieces of metal hurtling around a distant battlefield. As Islamophobic rhetoric reached new heights in our country over the course of the past year, I found myself closer to some degree of personal surrender than I've been at any point in my life, without even being aware that I was fighting. It was, unsurprisingly, a West Point classmate who recognized my malaise, helped me to identify it, and broke my fixation on the words of hate hurtling around the airwaves as chaotically as the aforementioned metal around the battlefield. You see, it's still true that I haven't sacrificed much at all, and when all's said and done, my sacrifice will still likely pale in comparison to that of the inspiring national servants to whom I've referred here today. But in many ways, my sacrifice began in earnest over the course of the last year. For the first time since raising my right hand to fight in the war on terror, I personally perceive precisely the sort of division in our society that terrorists dream of sowing. Whether they be domestic or foreign, people who would visit violence and fear on their fellow human beings in order to advance a twisted, discredited ideology know that the first step to that advancement is driving wedges between Americans. That was the goal of the perpetrators of the September 11th attacks, and they were roundly denied that goal by the incredible display of national service, unity, and compassion for the victims and their families. With well over 10,000 American Muslims like me serving in uniform as service members, and even more serving their communities as law enforcement officers and medical professionals, and with the nation's gracious acceptance of our service, just as it accepts the service of all the others who serve, they clearly did not succeed in sowing that division. But it is that division, that labeling of certain Americans as other or to be excluded, that remains a key goal of every anti-American terrorist group in existence today. Well, I refuse to be party to it. I refuse to equate the fear and misguidance of some of my fellow Americans to the hate that malicious actors would have them feel. I refuse to answer hate with hate. I make this refusal in the supreme confidence that we are far stronger, far more compassionate and decent than we are afraid. It's a confidence instilled by the examples of countless people far, far better than I. I will weather the fear and deny the hate, and I know that neither can break me. The flying metal of my past battlefields no longer seeks to harm me. In my mind's eye, I wear it like armor as I walk the road clear before me. It's a road paved by giants, lit brightly by their courage and their love. Always remember, never surrender. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Roberts, and thank you for your continuing service and for your 2 combat tours, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. I'm sure that these words were meaningful to our audience. At this point, I would like to ask George and Bobby McMullen to lay our wreath at our memorial. We began today's observance with a blessing by Rabbi Abramowitz, a Jewish rabbi. We've heard words of service by a young Muslim patriot. And then you get me. All of us defined by Christian standards are sinners. We are all less than perfect. No human is without fault. George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, Thomas Paine, George Mason, they and others, all our country's forefathers, were all sinners. They were less than perfect, but they had a vision, an aspiration. And one among them was credited with writing what I consider to be the most profound and most fundamental and foundational singular sentence in our American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were written by a sinner, just like the rest of us. This sinner, Thomas Jefferson, aspired to greater things for our country than what any mere mortal could have imagined. He was certainly well aware that, like all of us, he was human and that he was a sinner. May we all aspire to do as our forefathers would have wanted us to do. Now, as we reflect upon all the changes that have come as a result of 9/11/2001, I know that all of us would likely, in our emotions, wish that it was possible for us to change that day. The fact is that we're mere mortals, and we don't have that kind of moral authority, nor the strength or power that our Creator does to change history. We can only learn from it. There are good people all over the world. They come in all shapes, sizes, colors, ethnic backgrounds, and religions. There are also bad people in the world. They too come in a variety of shapes, sizes, colors, ethnic backgrounds, and religions. Don't let the bad ones pervert our sense of the good ones, nor their shapes, sizes, colors, ethnic backgrounds, or religions. Now let us observe a moment of silence for all those who we lost on the 11th of September 2001, and for those who have perished since as a result of the actions they took on that day and in response to that day in providing service to fellow man. And that certainly includes all of our military who have been fighting now for almost 16 years since those attacks. I'd now like to invite Mrs. Peggy Costigan to sing a verse of God Bless America.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land so fair as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. O'er the mountains, through the prairie, through the ocean, wide with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Thank you for standing, please. I'd like to thank everyone who made this event possible this morning, and thank you for your attention. Thank you for your attendance. This concludes our ceremony.